the Federals start wondering, can we actually win this war? We have the Confederates driving us directly away from Richmond when we get within 4 miles of the Confederate capital. They inflict severe casualties upon us at every turn for 7 days straight. All of a sudden, the tide of the war is turned, and all of a sudden, President Lincoln is worried that maybe that initial support for the war might fade after what happens here in Richmond. He's afraid that people will start to lose faith. They'll start to question whether they can win this war. And so Lincoln gets together with his advisors, and on July 17, 1862, he gets Congress to enact legislation authorizing the president to purchase land for national cemeteries across the country for soldiers who shall have died in service to their country. That system eventually expands into the War Department and under the command and operation of the Quartermaster General in the Army and the Secretary of War. But in 1862, 14 national cemeteries are established in 1 year, and that includes Antietam and Gettysburg. I'm sure a lot of you guys have been up there. Now, these first national cemeteries focus around former battlefields, former troop concentration spots, old post cemeteries. There's a lot of concern, especially for soldiers who have fallen out west in the Western campaigns. The Western campaigns cover such a vast amount of ground that they're concerned that these men will be lost forever, with the troops moving hundreds and hundreds of miles, much farther than they do in the Eastern campaigns. But then, of course, we have a turning moment. In November of 1863, President Lincoln comes to the Gettysburg National Cemetery to dedicate that cemetery and to reaffirm and to proclaim to everyone in the Union the moral, psychological, and political need for the national cemetery system. It's not just something for the soldiers out west. It's kind of the soothing balm for the nation after what comes to be about halfway through the war, when we've had so many deaths. Now, at the Gettysburg Address, which we're all familiar with, Lincoln goes on to explain very succinctly, very poignantly, that we've come to dedicate a portion of that field, being Gettysburg, as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that their nation might live. He says that these men have consecrated it far above our power to add or detract, and that the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. He tells people that the national cemeteries will help remind people that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, and that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. It's a message that spreads throughout the country, throughout the Union, the need for this national cemetery system, and that message reaches here in Virginia shortly after the war. Of course, during the war itself, it's difficult to establish a national cemetery in the South for obvious reasons, and so this national cemetery doesn't get established until 1866. However, in November of 1865, a Major General by the name of Folsom writes to the Quartermaster General that he has just visited the Glendale battlefield, and he was shocked by what he saw. He was shocked that he picked up 2 skulls within 15 feet of a neighborhood road, which was being used by the carriage of the inhabitants that morning on their way to church. He says, something's got to change. He says, now that we've won the war, now that we have Virginia back in the Union, we've got to do something for these dead. Hence the genesis of this national cemetery. In October of 1866, a brevet lieutenant colonel by the name of J.M. Moore acts as the quartermaster at that point in time, and he buys this whole land, about 2.1 acres, from Lucy and Ethelyn Nelson, who lived, of course, in that Nelson farmhouse just across the way. He buys it for $12,638. And the work here in the National Cemetery lasts from the next May into July. Just a couple months of work here, but in that time period, they bury almost 1,200 Civil War soldiers. Now, as I said, these soldiers are coming from not only Glendale, but Malvern Hill, Harrison's Landing down in the James River, the battles of First and Second Deep Bottom. As I said, however, of those 1,200 Confederate soldiers, only about 240 of them are known. They've so badly decayed by this point in time. And what happens to a lot of them is that they're put in a mass burial pit right underneath this flagpole bastion. Some of the other unknowns that you will see scattered throughout the cemetery, like I started out with, are Civil War dead as well, but this is the mass pit. This was the first burial pit right here, the genesis of that. Now, the first superintendent to take care of this property was a man who was a former veteran. He served with 126th New York. His name was Amos Potter. He was disabled. He lost an arm in the Civil War, and he served as the superintendent from 1866 to 1882, watching over this place, making sure it was well taken care of. He lived in what would be the National Cemetery Lodge, which is what is just behind me over here to my right. During this time period, he sees the cemetery evolve. A 2.1 acre plot into a carefully laid out grid of 4 different divisions, as they called it, of 162 graves each, 2 intersecting avenues 9 feet wide across, and concentric circles with a circular drive out in front. So they're thinking about this orderly way to bury the dead. They're not just throwing them in there in a random pit and walking away. They're trying to create an orderly system so that people, the families, the friends of these soldiers can come and visit them. Again, important to this concept of the good death. Now, as I said, one of the very unfortunate things about this particular cemetery is that we don't have a single identified soldier from Glendale. So when you walk around and you see an unknown soldier plot, it could be basically anyone. It could be, for instance, John Williamson of the 81st Pennsylvania, who fought here at Glendale and was killed. To give you a face to this story, this is a picture of John Williamson. Now, John Williamson writes several letters to his wife just before he dies. On May 18th, he writes to his wife. His wife has just given birth to a baby girl. He's never met his daughter, but he's excited to get home and see her. And his wife keeps writing these messages saying, "Oh, she's so beautiful. You have to come home and see her. You have to come home." And he writes letters back saying, "You have to stop writing such great letters because I'm going to be tempted to desert and come home. And you don't want that." He continues to write about his experiences in the South, about interacting with Confederates, about seeing slaves for the very first time, and his impressions of that. He also writes her on June 12th of 1862, "Take good care of yourself and the baby, but don't worry yourself about me. I'll take as good care of myself as I can on the battlefield and off it, but one thing I have to say to you is this: it is better to be a soldier's widow any day than a coward's wife. Your affectionate husband until death." The baby unfortunately dies a couple weeks later, so he never meets that baby, and the baby never meets him, because on June 30th, as I said, John Williamson is killed here at Glendale. It's very interesting to read the reports written by his friends and his comrades in his unit about his death. Remember this concept of the good death. Dying for an honorable cause, dying surrounded by friends and family who are there to comfort you, being buried in a Christian burial, being able to come and find the body. Listen for a couple of these things in the quotations from some of his comrades' letters. One of his comrades says, "I can hardly believe it yet because I did not see him fall myself, but Hoover, who's another man in the regiment, said he was doing his duty nobly, as he did at the Battle of Fair Oaks and in the 2 battles before. He and I were side by side in all the danger until Monday night, and he was in his place when I seen him last, but then the firing began." So he's going on saying he died a noble death. In the past few battles, he's fought nobly. He's died the good death. He's trying to reassure John Williamson's wife. He goes on, he says, "I am sure it will go hard with you, but God's will be done." Again, attesting to that religious need, that need for religious comfort upon his death. God's will be done, and it will be some consolation to you to know that he died a brave soldier's death, and that he was respected and esteemed by every man in the company. And for myself, I feel just like I did the day I left home. So again, reminding the wife, yes, he died this wonderful death. God's will be done. This was meant to happen. He was comforted at death. People respected him. Everything that a wife would need to hear. As I said, he is most likely buried in this cemetery, though we don't know where. Also probably buried in this cemetery is a man named George Kenny, who fought in the 71st Pennsylvania, And he arrives in Virginia earlier that spring, and he describes what a beautiful place it is. He's really impressed by how beautiful the Virginia area is. That must have been before the full summer heat kicked in. He writes, sending good wishes to his family and his friends back home, wanting his wife to take care of his affairs back home. And he writes back a couple of letters to his wife saying that they're received with unspeakable pleasure. This is the highlight of his day, to get messages from his wife. He also describes, however, that as the battles are intensifying in Virginia that spring, that he's gradually growing kind of numb to all the death around him. What was initially a shocking thing to see men die these horrific deaths is becoming kind of commonplace, and he's shocked that he's so numbed by it. He says, "It is no new thing for us to hear the sharp crack of infantry and the familiar sound fall in. Such is the case 5 or 6 times a day, and none the less at night. But we are always ready for them. In a few moments before our breastworks, and even if they ever attempt to attack the position our brigade holds, and they will be mowed down by hundreds. We are sure of victory. While I now write, the guns just a little to our left are pouring forth volumes of ball fire and smoke, such a thundering noise you have never heard. You can hear the shrill music of the ball as it plows through the air. And within 5 seconds, the report of its bursting, perhaps sending some poor soul into eternity. But we have become so used to such noise that we will sit, read, write, and talk together without even noticing it." Very interesting. A soldier who once probably started the war terrified of that noise, now sitting, eating, reading a book, talking to friends, while hearing those bullets whiz by and take the lives of some of his comrades. So even the soldiers are becoming numb to death. And after the death of George Kenny here at Glendale, we have similar letters going back to Kenny's brother and to his father. Letters reassuring them that Kenny has died the good death, saying that a rifle ball has just struck him below the waist on the left side and passed through him. I felt it a duty to write to you to tell you the details. Always brave, always honorable, truthful and just, and I felt it an honor to call him my friend, wrote one of the soldiers. Again, here's an honorable man. He did die the good death. Another man in the 72nd Pennsylvania also writes home to Kenny's father, expressing his condolences for Kenny's death. But he tries to reassure him. Again, that idea of the Christian burial, that it's all meant to be. He says, "I thought it was my duty as his friend to let you know the worst, hoping that the best will yet come. He's mortally wounded and ultimately dies of his wounds, so that I may hear he is alive. But if he is gone, he is now with the angel in heaven singing hallelujahs. He fell fighting for the glorious stars and stripes. You perhaps have lost a dear son, and I a valued friend." He then goes on to write about how he's going to send Kenny's personal effects to his family back at home. Again, this is a way of compensating for the fact that his family couldn't be there when their son actually died, so he's going to send some personal effects back to them. He says Lieutenant Schurz has his sword and diary, which he will forward at the first opportunity. So again, trying to bring that death closer to home and remind them that it's okay that they weren't here when he died, because they do have this small part of him still remaining. And again, letter after letter, talking about the claims of duty that Kenny sacrificed his life for, being proud friends of this brave man, that he had chivalrous courage, a lovely nature, and an abiding faith. And there's one interesting letter, finally, to conclude this series, from the assistant surgeon of another Pennsylvania unit. He writes about where Kenny is initially buried. He's later reinterred. He wants to write to let the family know that he's buried in the Glendale area so that if they ever get the chance to come down and visit, they can. Again, the idea of the good death. This assistant surgeon writes, although no kind father, fond mother, loving sister, or affectionate brother was there to soothe his dying moments, yet he was cheerful and resigned, and with his last breath whispered of home and his loved ones. He died as became a Christian, at peace with God and as a soldier on the battlefield. He was buried in an orchard near an apple tree. A headboard is placed at his grave with his name, regiment, and date of death inscribed thereon. The spot can be easily found, and should you desire to remove the body, I will cheerfully lend my aid. Now we know that body was never removed. We know that to this point in time, that body has never been found out on the battlefield, so we can only assume it is in here. Again, the marker long gone by the time they got to the body to place it in the cemetery. Now this is a familiar story over and over again. For any of the soldiers buried in here from the Civil War era, you could get these kinds of stories. So, with the continuation of the national cemetery system, the proliferation of these stories, the proliferation of these deaths, we're going to need more cemeteries. But again, there's a political problem. National cemeteries are brand new. How do you create legislation to expand the cemetery system? What are going to be the standards? There have to be standards for something as honorable and formal as a cemetery. And that's a very intriguing part of the evolution of the cemetery system. Don't want to make you guys walk out into the sun. I see that there's not really a good place to take a look at the lodge from here. So instead of moving, I'll just kind of tell you about how those standards get set in place. By 1867, Congress passes the National Cemeteries Act, saying that there's to be lodges, headstones, masonry walls, and continuous design and improvement of the landscape on the various national cemeteries. Again, look around you. What do you see? Very orderly cemetery. You see the lodge, you see the masonry walls, you see, of course, the trees, not original trees, but there were trees here. We have a sketch of what it looked like when those trees were first planted, improving that land, helping to make it look more peaceful. In 1868, we have the first Decoration Day. So, the predecessor to Memorial Day, people coming and laying flowers and wreaths on soldiers' graves. Following that, by 1870, we have almost 300,000 dead buried at over 73 national cemeteries across the nation. So this system has really skyrocketed. Imagine from 1866 to 1870, you have 73 national cemeteries, and again, 300,000 men. Burial parties are sent throughout the southeast to scour the battlefields for dead. And again, these more formal standards begin to be set into play. One of them being the design of the cemetery lodges themselves. Some of you might have noticed that on the front part of this lodge, it says 1873 carved onto the roof or placed on the roof in tile. This is a specific Second Empire style of architecture is what they call it. Every national cemetery is supposed to have one of these lodges. So that's how you can often recognize a cemetery from a distance, is seeing this standard form. Other quintessential features that you guys have probably seen in other national cemeteries are quotations from Theodore O'Hara's Bivouac of the Dead, which was written actually about the Mexican War, but it was later acquired and posted on placards in the cemetery. We do have one of those placards just outside, right before you enter the green grassy area. So again, formalism, standards, this is becoming a major national thing throughout the country. But as time wears on, people are going to start asking questions. They're going to start asking, well, we've taken care of the Civil War dead who died on the battlefield, but what about the living? What about the Civil War veterans who are alive, who are dying off gradually by the late 19th century? Another act needs to be passed, saying, okay, all honorably discharged veterans from the Civil War can be officially buried in a national cemetery. That takes care of that. But as you continue to expand, as America continues to get involved in more wars, especially toward the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, we start fighting in foreign countries. What about the foreign dead? What are we going to do there? 1899, more money is acquired for the recovery of fallen soldiers overseas. To go to these countries, like in the Spanish-American War, retrieve bodies and bring them back to national cemeteries. Eventually, national cemeteries are even made abroad in foreign countries. So very, very different idea of the burial system than what we started with back in the early 1800s. By 1920, legislation is passed saying that all veterans of all wars are eligible forever for burial in a national cemetery. So anybody, Civil War, Spanish American, World War I, and later on, of course, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War, all of those. It's not only the soldiers themselves, but it's also their spouses, their dependents, their children, which is what you're going to see a lot of buried in this cemetery. And by the 1930s, we see a lot of cemeteries expanding beyond the rural areas, which is what they're most commonly associated with, to more urban areas, San Francisco, Baltimore, New York, San Antonio, and so on. Now today, we have a total of 147 of these national cemeteries. The Veterans Administration takes care of 131 of them. Arlington and the Soldiers' Home are still run by the Army, and 14 of them are run by the Department of the Interior, the ones deemed most historically significant. We have 3.7 million soldiers buried in national cemeteries up to the present time. Imagine that. We had no national cemeteries during the Civil War. Now we have 3.7 million buried across the country. Really remarkable. Now in this yard around you today, we have about 2,000 total burials. As I said, about 1,200 of those from the Civil War, 800 coming from successive wars. Now this cemetery closes in 1970, meaning that unless you or your family reserved a plot in or before 1970, you can't be buried here. There's no more room. Occasionally we do have burials here. We just had one a couple summers ago. When I was actually working here, it was a dependent of the soldier who was buried, but those are the only people that you will see here. As we wrap this up, we got one final stop. Unfortunately, I am going to make you come out into the sun for this one because it is so important. We need to talk about the legacy of the National Cemetery System. We've talked about the nuts and bolts at this stop, how many people, how many acres of land, but how about that broader conception? We started talking about the need, the political need, the moral need for national cemeteries back in the 1860s, but how has that need been fulfilled today? And that's what we're going to conclude with out, as I said, in the sun on the other side of the cemetery. All right, one more.